Have you ever thought about it? Everything you see living around you, from the tiniest blade of grass to the largest whale, it's all part of this one giant engine. So today, we're going to pop the hood and see how it works. We're going to follow the fuel, the energy, all the way from a single ray of sunlight right through the entire web of life. So how does it all work? I mean, how does a single ray of sunlight power an entire forest? It seems impossible, right? Think about it. A forest, a coral reef, your local pond, they are all just bustling with activity. Where does all that energy actually come from? Well, the answer starts about 93 million miles away, with our sun. So yeah, let's follow the energy. Okay, so before we get too deep, let's just make sure we're on the same page with this word ecosystem. It's not just the living stuff, the plants and the animals. It's the whole shebang. It's how all those living things interact with the non-living environment, the water, the soil, the air. That whole complex dance, that's really the heart of ecology. All right, so the story of energy, where does it begin? It all starts with what we call the producers. These are the organisms that can literally capture the sun's power and turn it into fuel for everybody else. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this is the absolute foundation of all life. And there's a name for this amazing process: primary productivity. Put simply, it's just the rate at which plants are making food from sunlight. They're converting light energy into chemical energy and storing it as biomass. You can really think of it like the starting capital in an ecosystem's entire energy budget. It's the money in the bank. But, and this is a really crucial detail, not all the energy a plant captures actually gets passed on. You have to think about it in two parts. First, you've got the gross amount of energy it captures through photosynthesis. We call that GPP. But, just like us, a plant has to use some of that energy for itself, to grow, to repair, basically just to stay alive. And that energy it uses, it's pretty much lost as heat. So what's left over after the plant has paid its own energy bills, that's what we call the net primary productivity, or NPP. And that is the energy that's actually available for the herbivores and then the rest of the ecosystem to eat. So what does this all add up to on a global scale? Get this, the total net primary productivity for the entire planet. It's a mind-boggling 170 billion tons of organic matter every single year. That is the total amount of new fuel being pumped into the engine of life annually. Just incredible. Okay, so we've got all this energy now locked up in biomass. But obviously it doesn't just stay in the plants, right? It gets passed along, kind of like passing a torch from one organism to the next. So let's follow that flow. Now, we often think about this as a nice, simple food chain. The grass is eaten by a grasshopper, the grasshopper gets eaten by a frog, and on and on. But let's be real, nature is rarely that simple. A much more realistic picture is something called a food web. This shows how all these different food chains are tangled up and interconnected. A single species might eat a bunch of different things and get eaten by a bunch of other things. It's messy. So to make sense of this big, complex web, ecologists have a system. They organize organisms into what are called trophic levels. It's really just a fancy way of describing where an organism sits in the food chain. So you have the plants, the producers, they're at the very bottom. The herbivores that eat them, they're the primary consumers. The carnivores that eat them are the secondary consumers. And you get the idea. It goes on up the chain. Okay, now I'm going to give you a number. And this number, it changes everything. The number is 10%. Seriously, this single number is one of the most fundamental rules in all of ecology. It's often called the 10% law, and it pretty much dictates the entire structure of life as we know it. So here's what it means. When a herbivore eats a plant, it only gets to use about 10% of the energy that was stored in that plant. The other 90%? It's just lost, mostly as body heat. And the same thing happens when a carnivore eats that herbivore. It's like a massive 90% energy tax at every single step up the food chain. Insane, right? And that is exactly why we always picture energy flow as a pyramid. Because so much energy gets lost at each step, the amount of energy that's actually available shrinks dramatically as you go up the trophic levels. This is also why food chains can't just be infinitely long. After a few levels, there's just not enough energy left to support a top predator. Now, of course, this pyramid is a simplified model. It's great, but it has its limits. Nature isn't always a neat, tidy chain. What about an animal like a bear?
It eats berries and fish, so it's on multiple trophic levels at once. And probably most importantly, this whole pyramid model completely leaves out one absolutely vital group, the decomposers.
So far, we've been following the energy as it flows in one direction, up that pyramid. But hang on, what about all the organisms that die at every single level? That's where the decomposers come in. They are the cleanup crew, the engine of the ecosystem's incredible recycling system. They make sure that absolutely nothing goes to waste. And decomposition isn't just one thing happening, it's actually a 5-step process. First up, you've got fragmentation. That's when things like earthworms break dead stuff into smaller pieces. Then there's leaching, where all the water-soluble nutrients seep down into the soil. After that comes catabolism, where bacteria and fungi really go to work, breaking it down even more. This leads to something called humification, which creates that dark, super nutrient-rich soil layer we call humus. And finally, the last step is mineralization. This is where the humus releases those raw minerals back into the soil, making them available for plants to suck up and start the whole cycle all over again. It's a perfect loop. And this brings us to a really important distinction. See, unlike energy, which just flows through an ecosystem and is eventually lost, matter gets recycled over and over again. This movement of essential nutrients, we're talking carbon, phosphorus, all that good stuff, through both the living and non-living parts of an ecosystem, that's what we call nutrient cycling. And we can basically lump these cycles into two main types. First, you have the gaseous cycles, like the carbon cycle. For these, the main storage tank, the reservoir, is in the atmosphere. Then you have the sedimentary cycles, like the phosphorus cycle, where the main reservoir is locked up in the Earth's crust, in rocks. Okay, so we've got this constant flow of energy and this endless recycling of matter. But here's the thing. These systems aren't static. They're not frozen in time. They change, they grow, they mature. And this whole dynamic process of change is called ecological succession. It's literally how a barren, empty landscape can eventually become a thriving forest. So, what is ecological succession? Well, it's the gradual, pretty orderly process of community change. It's this fairly predictable sequence where one group of organisms slowly replaces another and then another until a final, stable community is established. And this whole process can kick off from two really different starting points. First, you have primary succession. This is when life begins from absolute scratch. We're talking bare rock after a volcano erupts, for instance. And it is incredibly slow because the soil itself has to be created from nothing. On the other hand, you've got secondary succession. This happens after a big disturbance, like a forest fire, where the life might be gone, but the soil is still there. And as you can probably guess, that rebuilding process is way, way faster. Now, every succession story has its key players. First up, you've got the pioneer species. These are the super hardy organisms, like lichens, that can actually live on bare rock. They are the true trailblazers. As they do their thing, breaking down rock and creating the first bits of soil, they pave the way for a whole series of transitional communities. We call these seral stages. Each stage changes the environment just a little bit, making it suitable for the next group of species, until finally you reach the end goal, the climax community. This is that mature, stable forest that's basically in perfect balance with its environment. So, let's recap. We've seen how energy makes a one-way trip through an ecosystem, while matter gets endlessly recycled. It's this really intricate dance that creates the stable yet constantly changing world that we all depend on. Which brings us to one last and pretty crucial question. Now that we understand these fundamental rules of the game, what does it mean for the long-term health of our own planet when our activities start messing with these ancient and absolutely essential cycles?